Okay, now that we have seen some of the basics, let's go take a look at a somewhat more involved case, which is this JSP, which actually has a form. So here what we are going to do is something slightly different. We will load this particular var file, which is jspforms.var, but we are going to do something interesting. Our first step, the very first thing that JSP forms itself. So when we load JSP forms as a var, right, the context that is taken here, context path that is taken here, is actually JSP forms itself. So let's just see what I'm saying here. So we go there, we see JSP forms, and if we load jspforms.var, right, the context, the base is JSP forms itself. So what should happen when we click on JSP forms? So far, for example, in this web.xml of hello JSP, this URL pattern, the first one you visit, corresponds to this servlet, which corresponds to this servlet class. So far we have directly contacted servlet classes. This time we are going to instead contact a JSP file, which is the first thing we will do. So JSP forms and / is the opening URL, and that will go to a servlet. But as we have seen, it is actually a servlet underneath, even though it looks like a standard JSP to us. This is identified by using the JSP file tag rather than the servlet class tag. So we will open by going to a JSP file. See, this is very similar to what happens in FairShare, because when you do FairShare, you first open it up by going to let's get FairShare started just to see. So we have we'll start Apache and we will start FairShare. Localhost 8080. It's taking some time to start. Let's see, it will probably come up. Not localhost 8080. This is localhost 80. Okay, here we are. So localhost 80 is working, and if you take a look at this, you always first visit an HTML page. This is what you visit. So this is similar to what is going on in this case, which is we will visit a JSP page. In this case, the page we visit will be JSP forms, JSP form. Okay, so this is the web page which we are going to visit. And just like FairShare, which is far off in apps XMPP, XMPP7, XMPP, CGI bin, FairShare, not CGI bin, it's an htdocs, FairShare post.html. So just like we have a form over here, we are this time going to have a form in JSP style. So the same thing, there is some this percent arrow material is JSP. What this says is this is a page and the language used will be Java, etc., etc. So in principle, JSP, which is a general purpose template language, can also use other languages, but I guess in practice that didn't happen so very much. So this is what we end up with. So we have a form, and it is the form that then goes to the second page, which is this one, JSP show. And it is JSP which takes us to the JSP forms class. So this is clear. We first visit a JSP page which is kind of like the HTML page, and just as the HTML page sends you to a CGI bin script, here the JSP sends you to a JSP show, which turns out to be a servlet class. Okay, so that's what we are going to do. And now that we have it loaded, let's leave this alone. Now that we have it loaded, let's go here, and this is what we see. We have a form. It's very bare bones, and it has two buttons, JSTL and JSP. I chose this because this is very similar to how our final GUI like app is going to be, with a text field and with 3 buttons and some other things, and we will take a look at the details of that later. But this gets you the fundamental things that you need in order to get the 3-button version working. These words is defaults, and in practice, if we now put something here, then either of these 2 buttons will take us to the backend and show us something. What that something is, we'll see in a minute. Okay, let's take a look at this. So we have a form action as usual, and here we have an input ID whose name is my field, and here the name is JSTL button and versus JSP button. This corresponds to the 2 buttons that we see. So this is JSTL button, this is JSP button. This sends the value JSTL and JSP, and this is the text that you actually see. So these are the so-called button tags, and the placeholder is defined over here. So this is what shows up. Now that's as far as the form is concerned. Now let us see what happens when we come to the JSP forms class. So here we have the JSP forms class, and here's what we do. We set the request attribute as usual, because we are going to use it elsewhere. And when that form is clicked, it invokes this class, the post method. And the post method in this case actually is no different from get, so it internally sends you to the get method. And you get all these things. Now comes this business of the request dispatcher. Remember that previously when we looked at Hello JSP, we generated a request dispatcher which took us from the servlet class to a JSP. Here we have arrived from a JSP via a post to this get, and for this request we are going to generate a request dispatcher later. And here are the 2 things we do. We first check if there is a parameter called JSTL button, and if there happens to be one, then we say that we are going to do JSTL processing. By the way, we haven't seen what JSTL is yet, and we'll get to it in a minute. But there are 2 things. There is one thing called JSTL and another thing called JSP. We are first going to look at JSP, but this app has JSTL as well, and we will see why in a little bit. But the point is that this string arrives via the request parameter. What is this string? This string is the name that we gave. So key value pairs arrive at the servlet. The name is this one and the value is this one, depending on which button was pressed. So let's see what all these things do. In this case, this is a HTML tag as usual. This is the ID. So the ID of a tag is something that is used on the client side whereas the name is something which is sent to the server side. There are some situations, some of which we have seen before, where there is some confusion between these two for various arcane reasons, and unfortunately we have to test and get this kind of thing right. This is a button that submits a form and it sends this value to the backend when that happens. Okay, so that's the basic information transfer. And now, having determined whether it was JSTL or whether it was JSP by using this parameter, we take these two paths. In one path we set the title to JSP, and our request dispatcher this time invokes either JSP env.jsp or JSP tag env.jsp. So that's the distinction. What tag is we'll get to in a minute, so ignore the JSTL part for now, just concentrate on the JSP part. So this is what we are going to do. Okay, so we came from a JSP to a servlet class, and from this servlet class we are going again to a JSP. So this time there are two JSPs. Again, this is very reminiscent of what goes on in the case of FairShare, which is if you submit this information here, then something gets generated by the backend. Okay, in this case it's just generating whatever you sent it, and it comes back. If this were HTML, then we would see it as HTML, but the point is you go from a form to a CGI bin which generates another potential HTML, and that's what is going on here. So from one JSP you come to this class, from this class you go to one of these two JSPs. And what does JSP env look like? Well, let's take a look. So JSP env. And this is where JSP now starts getting interestingly complicated. So first of all, you have head title, and the job of JSP env is to tell you all the parameters of the request and all the attributes of the request. So before we understand this code, let us see what this thing actually does. So I'll put this thing here and we are going to click JSP as we said, and this is the result. We get this parameters table which says that there was a my field and there was a JSP button, and these are the values that we put in it, and that is precisely what we expect from looking at this guy JSP. So parameter is my field, and the value in this case is whatever we put in, and JSP button is this one whose value happens to be JSP. That's what we got. Now, as far as the attributes are concerned, here are some internal attributes, and this is the attribute that we put in, which is title JSP, plus notice that the title itself has changed. So if we look at the source for this, we see what we are supposed to get. And by the way, these two blank lines are because of these two guys. So that's what we get. Doc type HTML, etc. So what is happening is it's generating two tables, and in this each table it is generating two different rows. So this is the first row and this is the second row. Okay, so let's see how it generates that. So here we have what is getting generated. Okay, so we have div, align, center, etc., etc. up to here, which is our first table, our first div. That's what we have here. And these things, table, border, etc., are fixed. But this is where, in the middle of all this HTML, we have some Java code. Notice that this Java code behaves exactly like the original Java code we wrote. So it does things like get the request object, get parameter names, and this happens to be a Java enumeration. So we loop over this thing and we get this kind of thing back. So each time we do that, we are generating these sorts of things. Rows, the parameter name, and then corresponding to that parameter name, the parameter in the request. And as we saw, the result is this one. Yeah, so you have parameters and you have their values, request parameter and request value. All right, I'll keep this on the screen for a minute more, and then now the second table generation is pretty much the same as this one. So another such table, another such loop. Nothing very complicated. But there is something, slightly awkward about this, that in the middle of all this HTML, all of a sudden there is JavaScript code. And how this works again is like what we saw for this one, which is for the earlier class generation. So same kind of thing goes on here. We have JSP forms and we have JSP env.jsp. So this huge generated thing with a bunch of outright, etc., tab /r/ and whatnot. And this is our code, which it takes and puts straight in the middle. So by the way, when you write this code, you have to remember that these kinds of things are there. And one other interesting thing to note is that because this code is taken as it is and put inside the context of a full servlet, these names like request carry the same meaning that they did for the servlet, naturally enough, because aside from, so by the way, the name here happens to be, instead of do get, it is actually underscore JSP service, but it's still request and it's still response, and it's basically the same code. So these kinds of things are called implicit objects, and we will look at a few more examples. So request is available and out is available, and these are well understood because of the same kind of thing that we do here, which is out is explicitly defined as one of the variables in this JSP service. So all of these are implicit values. So page context is there, and session is there, and application. We haven't used all of those, but just to let you know that this is where these implicit objects come from. They are names which are automatically generated by the system. Okay, so let's go over everything once more just to clarify. We started off by looking at the web.xml, which points out that our entry point, which is this URL for JSP forms, takes us to this JSP file. This JSP file contains an action which calls JSP forms, and in turn JSP forms, although that part is not visible here, invokes JSP-env.jsp inside this class by binding it like this, and that choice in turn is based on the button which we saw over here. Okay, so that's the full story. And now let's put it all together explicitly. So in the JSP file definition, you can straight away include code, or you can include this kind of value here. So that's what we see. This is the value of the title, which is just a string, and this is the code. But this is still, imagine doing something that complicated using out.write yourselves, and you will see why it makes perfect sense to not do such a thing. So our this thing reminds us why this damn thing is so complicated. So there we go. If you had to write it by hand, you would have to do something ugly and messy like this. Instead of that, even with this code, it's a lot better. These things, by the way, are called scriptlets, which are little pieces of Java code. And so for anything beyond simple inclusion, you need something like Java code, it would seem. But this is where you can actually do a bit better, and that's where the something called tag libraries comes in. So tag libraries are a way of simplifying these types of loop-like things and a few other decision making, etc., that arise in designing these kinds of systems. One goal behind things like tag libraries was that since the front end, which is these kinds of forms and layouts and all, are done by designers who are not necessarily programmers, you want a much simpler language over there, which is easier for designers to understand. It looks a lot more like HTML and does not suddenly throw large chunks of code at you. That is one driving reason, and the other is that for the same reason, programmers themselves find it much easier to use. And this is why our app has these two paths. So one path takes you down the JSP road, which involves these things called scriptlets, and the other takes you down tag libraries, which is a simplified version of the same thing. So let's see what the tag version of the same file looks like. First thing, you need to include these two things over here. One is you need to say I'm going to use a tag library, this particular one, and that I will refer to the tag library with the prefix C. And now you can, let's compare what it looks like with and without the tag library. So this is our without tag library, where you have a loop. Instead, that gets simplified to the far easier thing like this. So here we have a for each, and the syntax is very similar to how for each is in languages. You have tr, td, etc., etc., and each time you are going to generate a row, and there is a for each over here to end it. These things, the $param, these are, so just like we saw that request and out are implicit objects for JSP, param, which refers to the parameters of a request, is an implicit object for JSTL. This happens because just like this generated code here contains predefined variables, similarly the generated code for the JSTL contains these guys as predefined variables. Let's just see what that is like. So we have JSP one moment, I'll have to locate that a bit. Okay, so here we have the JSP tag env. It is in the same directory, but I had to generate it by visiting it. Doesn't really matter. Let's take a look at what you see here for params. So this $param etc. will be made available by doing some fairly ugly looking processing going on over here. So in that sense, these kinds of $param etc. are expected in one of these types of things. So probably somewhere in the implements etc. It's not very obvious in all this mess where it is, but in any case, that is what the existence of those implicit values means. So in short, param is a map which is available. So map as in Java map with a key and a value, and so this corresponds to the entry of the map, which is p.key, and so there's a thing called proprietary evaluate, I guess, where the runtime is actually evaluating these things in the page context. And so you have p key and p value, and so you see these. Now we will skip over attributes a little bit and go to HTTP headers. So just as param is a built-in or an implicit object, HTTP headers are also available as implicit objects, and the loop over those is equally straightforward. But the loop over attributes is a bit funky. This time, the tag library alone does not do the job. Instead, we have to use old style JSP code, and in this object, something called page context, you have to actually get all the attributes and set it over here. So compare this with JSP-env.jsp. So just as we got these attributes here, request get attribute names, we got them over here. We put it in page context, which is one of those implicit objects that we saw here in the generated code for JSP-env.jsp. So in short, the implicit objects of JSP are also available within JSTL, but JSTL is a more elaborated version of JSP. And so what we have is, you have to actually generate one of these attributes, which then becomes available as a variable. So somewhere in that generated code, this param variable is also created in the same style, but it is implicit in the code rather than we having to do it. Now, all these complexities, you will become more familiar with them in time. I don't expect that this one lecture is going to, you shouldn't worry too much if you don't understand all the nuances. See, the template idea begins small, simple JSPs look nice, and then when JSTLs and all come in, all sorts of new things start happening. But it's just a layered extension of these ideas. And by the way, to get started doing something like this is perfectly fine. Once you get used to it, then you can decide whether something like a tag library is what you need. Now, as we will see, these kinds of complicated server-side creations are not necessarily that common nowadays. There are other alternatives, But in practice, you will encounter a lot of code like this if you go to work in industry and happen to work in a Java shop. Furthermore, these are not limited to Java, as we will see later. Bottom line, for now, all you have to remember is this. There is a simple way to do for loops instead of doing it through code. For some types of maps over which you can loop, they are already built in. For other types of maps, you will have to create them yourselves. And the same is true if you have user generated maps, in which case also you can use these kinds of objects in order to create your own map, and then you can use the for loop to go over it. That is why I showed you all these variations. And so with the tag library, you can generate these tables very easily. Whereas with JSP, generating those tables was a sufficient pain that I just stopped after parameters and attributes and didn't really bother to do the JSTL style tables with HTTP and all that. But I could have used the same kind of code as should be obvious to you. Okay, now let's consolidate a little bit. So what we have now is key ideas. Instead of code generating text, code exists within text. This works okay, but you get these problems where you have, for anything more than beyond simple inclusion, you need Java code, and instead you use tag libraries to have simpler methods, and then the tags themselves get compiled into servlets. The most important thing is this is simple automation of what could have been done by hand but would have been erroneous or error prone and tedious. And as we saw, applications are a mixture of servlets and JSPs. The entry point the very first thing is often a JSP, but after that you might go into a servlet which dispatches off to other JSPs. So we have two JSPs. There's the entry point JSP and the JSP which is generated by the servlet for our simple application. And as far as this JSP is concerned, you have either code inclusion or values, or the complicated version which is tag libraries, which happen to involve syntax like C:, etc. Where, by the way, to remind you again, the C part at least was our choice, where we said we are going to use this prefix for all the things like for each and all which are built into the JSTL library. Now the exact syntax and all the details, people have written entire books on these things. The core idea I just want you to keep in mind is this is basic string jugglery, no more, no less. But you do need access to some data, and so you have to work with Java objects in order to get that access. What happens then is certain objects become implicitly available, such as request, out, session, and for the JSTL there are implicit objects. So JSTL implicit objects are params, headers. Param and header, which is the collection of objects available in JSTL. Whereas these are the ones that are available in JSP. Jasper, which you will sometimes encounter, is a JSP compiler, and JSP are compiled, and the compiled version is cached by putting it in the work directory, as we have seen. At this point, our basic job is actually done, because we know how to make forms and we know how to do it with good looking, or well, we haven't paid much attention to the looks, but at least organizationally something like this is far simpler than doing output by outputting strings. What remains is some of the more tedious parts of JSPs, which is related to debugging. So the whole system is fairly finicky, and so I'll show you some errors and how to find them. So here we are going to delete this beginning slash, save it, and deliberately create a erroneous version. By the way, no compilation is needed because this is just a change in web XML. So all I'm going to do is reassemble it into a WAR file. I will stop this. Oh, not in hello JSP. We need to go to JSP forms, and there we need to let me just make sure. Yeah, so we changed it in JSP forms, and I need to take this and turn it into JSP forms. Okay, so here we have a bunch of things. We have webinf and a bunch of JSPs, JSP form, JSP tag env, etc, etc. So I'm going to stop this one. Yeah, this sometimes, so this, we ran into this bug. I don't actually know why this bug is there, but it says you can reset this whatever it is going on by going to the main manager page. So you just go back and okay, so stop the application, and now we will undeploy it. Okay, so we have undeployed it. Let's remove the clutter by also removing this. Well, leave it alone. Okay, so JSP forms. So the deployment part is okay, but watch what happens now. Okay, so what it said is it could not find a resource. But it said this, so why would it have said that? Because after all the JSP forms and all these details are there. However, if you look at this, starting itself didn't happen. Let's try and start it. Okay, now when you try to start it, it tells you something. It says application at context path, JSP forms, etc. could not be started, encountered an exception, yada yada yada, some context forms, etc. When this happens, what you should do is you have to go to the place where there are Tomcat logs and just grep for the fail thing. So here what it says is the manager complains, because it is the manager which could not find these things. So let's take a look at what is in this manager log 21, and we have okay, so there is a lot of interesting things here, but the important lines tend to be called caused by. So this is one of the bad things about this whole system, by the way. The Java errors are so voluminous that figuring out what to pay attention to is tricky. And here it says very clearly that JSP/JSP form must start with a slash. So a mistake, a small mistake in the configuration, it is not so easy to get it checked, and instead you get this giant mess after deployment. And if you didn't pay attention to all these details, it is very easy to get lost in all this. So severe fail, then there is some exception, and finally you find it in the caused by. So that's one of the more painful aspects of this thing. So I have already changed this and removed the slash, and so we should be just fine in a minute. So I will create this jar. Create this jar and let us redeploy the thing. So since it couldn't start, we will undeploy it and we will redeploy it. And this time the start went through well, which basically means that this is going to work as expected. Of course, that's not a surprise because we had deliberately created this error. But this is an example of an error which occurs in the manager. Now let's introduce another kind of error, and this time we will create the error in a JSP file. So let's go here and misspell this get_attr. Okay, and now we are going to introduce yet another error here, but this time, although we changed Java code, remember that it's a change in the JSP file, so we don't need to compile anything. The compilation is going to be get done by the server. So we do that, remove our working library, deploy the library with the error, and let's see what happens. So we have this works because so far we haven't encountered that particular problem, but as soon as we do this one, we get the method get_attr string is undefined for the HTTP request, and here we have get_attr. So not bad, pretty good error message, all things considered. The stack trace and the error message are all nicely separated from each other. So those are the two kinds of errors which you will find from time to time, and now we can fix it. Again, do that, come here, stop, undeploy, redeploy, and it's all good. So here we go, do JSP, etc, etc. So those are the two types of errors, but you have to be patient and you have to wade through a lot of junk in order to figure out where those errors lie. There is no simple way to actually do this kind of thing at compile time. You have to suffer to some degree through the runtime troubles. There are ways to deal with it and do some kind of testing, but we'll look at it later if we get time. For now, let's try to summarize where we are. So we have gone through JSP. We know now that there is basic JSP and there are tag libraries, and both of them are essentially ways of generating web pages which are dominated by markup and which are done by designers. But there is code related material in there, and so you try to isolate that and solve this problem by translation. So one difference is that while this kind of technology is still in use, and it certainly is in many of the enterprises and banks and things like that, but by and large for most of the sleek consumer sites, you avoid heavyweight HTML server generation. Back when these kinds of things were generated on servers, one reason was that browsers were still evolving and kind of flaky, and it took time for people to update these things. But for about the last decade or more, maybe the last 12-13 years, browsers have become self-updating. They are updated very, very quickly and reliably. And so we say these are evergreen browsers. And so most of them, when they acquire a capability, all of them copy each other and acquire the capability very, very fast. So as a result, you can reliably use front-end JavaScript based markup. And on the server side, what you do is you ship data, often as JSON. And on the browser, so JSON is this data format which comes with JavaScript. In this course, I don't know now how much time, if any, we will get to spend on JavaScript. If not, we'll continue in a future course. And then on the browser side, you take this JSON data and you can render that in a device appropriate manner. But by the way, now you have to replicate something like the template functionality on the browser side. There is no escaping the actual work. It's mostly a question of where you do it. And then at this point, these are our pieces. We know server-side programming, we know templates and forms, we have state with cookies, database connections, logging. Testing, we didn't get a chance to get into this time, but we'll take a look at testing later. There is something called embedded Tomcat, which you can use for some kinds of testing. And next week, we will assemble all these into a complete app. The important thing to remember is these problems are universal to web applications. They are not Java specific. So all the ultra modern things like Go and Elixir, and even the not so ultra modern things like Node.js and PHP, Ruby, Python, etc., all of them have URL routing with libraries and configurations, state management with sessions and cookies, template libraries, forms and other kinds of input, database connectivity, and so on. A good way to learn all these things is basically to take our sample apps, especially this particular chain from Hello with servlets to Hello with JSP and JSP forms, and implement them in each of these technologies. You will find out that things aren't that different actually. There is no clear-cut superiority over Java, except perhaps Java tends to be verbose and the others are often perceived or actually are friendlier. One important difference between the Java technologies and some of the other ones like Ruby, especially Ruby on Rails and some of its cousins in the Java world like Spring Boot, etc., is that they remove a lot of the complexity of detailed configuration of the kind we saw in WebXML, etc., by means of what is called convention over configuration. So if you agree to design your app in a way that is prescribed by the designer of the framework, then you get a lot of these configuration type things for free. And in practice, it means a great deal. So there is real value in following the prescriptions of a framework. Some of the further developments along these lines are newer systems that try to do even more wrapping. And what this wrapping means, we will eventually discuss in a lecture where we will talk about what is called the REST architecture of the web, or representation state transfer. And at that point, we will be able to see a much higher level view of the web. Right now, we are in the weeds with all the details and the tag libraries and so on and so forth. But by and large, once you get used to it and once you are familiar with one set of these things, it is not really that hard. Just tedious and annoying, and you have to keep track of a great many details. I forgot to note one important difference between the JSP versus the JSTL, and it is this. So if you look at the two JSPs, the differences are primarily whether there is just the JSP syntax with these percentages and with this %at versus the JSP tag ANV, which contains these things, and the tag library is mentioned here. Now JSP is in some sense built into Tomcat, in the sense that you get the JSP processing for free, but for the tag libs you actually have to import certain libraries which are there in the examples that come with Tomcat. So you can look up in the examples directory, but these are the tag libraries. So this is called taglibs, impl and taglibspec. These libraries you have to move into the libs directory over here in webinf. And when you create the war file, here, webinf also contains the lib. So lib only shows up in this case if you compare with any of the earlier ones, such as here. As you will see, lib is empty, and this is why we have lib for the few cases where certain standard jar files must be included. So in order to get this kind of code working, you will need to include the tag libs in this in the lib directory. That in addition to that, there is one thing that is worth saying, which is this. Examples, it is JSP samples. So in these examples there is servlet examples and there is JSP examples. From the JSP examples we don't look at too many very complicated things, but a few of them, like for example this carts thing, is very similar to the kinds of processing that we have done. And so you should take a look at how they have done this thing, because our application bears a lot of similarities to the kinds of processing that this carts example needs. And in their source they have also shown how the cart itself is implemented with these for loops in a different style, explicit. They don't use JSTL, it is JSP only, but it's still interesting to see how these things are put together. Here is another example of JSP servlet JSP, where they show how a JSP page can call a servlet, and how a servlet can call JSP in turn using a different method. This one we will revisit later, but I wanted to point out that here are some examples that you should take a look at. Similarly, there is for each and there is choose and a bunch of other things. So here they show another way where you use page context set attribute, kind of the same way we did, and you can loop over for loops like this. So those are some of the other examples about simple JSP things that you can find. Here is another one where some decision making is going on, and so we have C:(if), just like we have C:(for), and there is syntax for testing things and so on. We may find this useful as we go ahead in the application. So that's all I wanted to note, and okay, see you next time. Thanks.